Hello, I'm James Gillies, and I've been asked to answer some questions about my job in audiobooks. Things like how do you get into acting, how do you organize projects, how do you safeguard them, all that sort of thing. So here goes. How did I get started? Well, I knew I wanted to act when, as a 9-year-old, I saw Olivier's Richard III on television. I watched it 10 times in 2 weeks. Don't ask, it's a long story. I don't mean Richard III, I mean me watching it 10 times. Sadly, when I had my chance in the late 70s, I opted to train as a teacher, bending to family pressure to do the safe job. What can I say? I was young. Then the BBC came along, and I broadcast, actually, on television and radio for about 22 years. Happily, for me, I acquired a new wife with a keener perspective than me, a performer who convinced me that regardless of my false start, I too could still perform. It wasn't too late. So I left the Beeb in 2013 and I started afresh. And for about 18 months, I absorbed every relevant skill set I could find, not at all sure of my ultimate course, but definitely needing to throw off a couple of decades of corporate dust. In that 18 months, I did a bit of everything, really. Film, television, ads, e-learning, whatever they threw at me. In 2015, an American filmmaker asked me to narrate his audiobook about Alexander Hamilton. That's he of recent Broadway fame. It had 50 characters and they spoke in 3 languages. I was hooked. I was in my own one-man show. I was playing all the parts. And since my client wasn't British, I was actually being paid reasonably well, too. So I looked for more projects. Starting slowly, I doubled my output roughly every 6 months, and I am now approaching my 80th book, which sounds a lot, but in fact is still relatively few compared to some of the giants of the industry. But they were all very good books. Well, maybe there is that one we don't talk about. So we won't talk about it. I still do all the other stuff when asked, but, being paid to tell great stories by great writers, that's a recipe for a happy life. Who wouldn't? I'm most content when I'm balancing 3 projects. That was one of the questions. 1 book in preparation, 1 being recorded, and 1 being proofed. In terms of actual hours, recording the book takes the most time, the proofer's corrections the least, and the prepping of the next book falls somewhere in between the 2. Do you get confused between the books? No, there's never a blur between projects any more than there is confusion between the courses in a 3-course meal. Each one is completely distinct. In fact, in many ways, prepping an upcoming book after a day of recording the current one is actually a great relaxation. It reestablishes perspective. Archiving. I have a master folder on the desktop of my iMac called DP. This stands for Dramatis Personae. It contains almost every character I have ever created in an audiobook. Each has their own audio file containing about 30 seconds worth of characteristic dialogue. DP sits there and in a few other places as part of my archive. I have had authors reintroduce characters from books I narrated a couple of years earlier, so the DP is like my personal repertory company. It's always on call. I was asked about safeguarding work. I had a major computer crash in 2018. I'd driven the poor machine hard for over 2 years. I'm not sure I'd even turned it off. Like an idiot, I hadn't backed up, even though there were built-in systems for doing so. I literally paid them no heed. So with help from Apple, I retrieved about 60% of my archives, but a score or more of books and characters were gone, probably, I thought, forever. I learned my lesson. My data is now shared across 4 drives, 2 in the cloud, in case of fire. By the way, soon after that, one of my most prolific clients reintroduced a major character into her latest book. The original audiobook was gone in the crash. I ended up having to buy it and download it. Let me see, favorites. I was talking to a colleague the other day who said he had enjoyed a particular short story in a project we'd worked on together. I remarked it sounded interesting, and I said I would give it a listen. He then reminded me that I had actually narrated it. I had completely forgotten. Though to be fair, At that particular moment he asked the question, my mind had been elsewhere. You know, the truth is that while I'm working on a story, it is my whole world. I inhabit it. But also, logically, when the next arrives to take its place, I am forced to move on. Which is not to say that I abandon my books. They're all special to me. If you ask me about a former project at a party, and regardless of how long ago I produced it, I will bore you silly recounting why it's worth listening to. Technical competence. There's a television series about ice truckers whose mantra apparently is, if you break down out here and can't get going again, you're gonna die. You know, regardless of your job, it's plain common sense to know your kit. This industry relies on expensive, highly technical software and hardware. You need to know what you can fix, and you need to know what you can't fix. Indecision can lead to missed deadlines. Sometimes I edit an audiobook too, though often it goes to an editor because you have to know where to draw the line. And that means learning how to use those tools and your limits. By the way, I never proof an audiobook I have narrated. In my opinion, that way lies madness. I believe proofers are the heroes of our industry, but that's probably for a different discussion. Listening to others. I buy a couple of audiobooks every month, partly for fun and partly to learn from others. Learning is a lifetime activity. I can both admire and be critical of others' performances, though I always keep my opinion to myself. I never compare myself to other narrators. There's always going to be a Mozart to your Salieri. Isn't a 20-hour-long book a bit scary? Not necessarily, no, but you do have to treat it with respect. Much wiser heads than mine have pointed out that audiobooks are marathons, they're not sprints. And after all, narrators don't just have to read for extremely long hours in a tiny booth. You also have to find from within them a diverse cast of characters. You have to invest each with their own truth, all the while paying laser-like attention to the story and to the text, and hoping the listener tunes you out and wraps themselves in the story instead. If you get that balance right, who wouldn't be happy doing the job? Anyway, apparently that's me. James Gillies, audiobook narrator. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.